Guys, I have something to tell you. This is a bit more of a sad intro than I usually like to do for these videos, but it's something that's deeply important to me. Well, I'm British. I know, that's a lot to take in, but put that aside for a moment and save your grieving for later. From a young age, being from this island of knives and Mini Coopers, I have been indoctrinated into watching the long-running film franchise, James Bond. It's kind of a rite of passage in the UK to have a favourite Bond actor, even if you've never seen a James Bond film, and every time an Aston Martin drives past, you have to go, "Oh my god, James Bond car!" So, as a lifelong Bond fan, when I discovered 007 First Light was coming out, I was extremely excited. I mean, I was raised on the Daniel Craig films, as I'm sure many of you watching this video were. That includes the good and the not so good. But that aside, this meant that finally we might get a James Bond game better than Bloodstone or Quantum of Solace. I mean, those games were interesting. And no, I don't want to acknowledge GoldenEye. Look at the Bloodstone gameplay. And although I do harbour a safe space in my heart for both 007 Bloodstone and Quantum of Solace, this game blows them both out of the water and it's not even funny. The first time I finished First Light, I had to just sit back and go like, wow, that is a great game, like, that is James Bond at his most Bondiest. But, you know, as the old saying goes, you only live twice. And I truly believe this is the second coming of truly great Bond games, which means I have to milk it for content. So, here we are today. The only time guns or gadgets will be permitted in this challenge run are when the game absolutely will not let us progress without using them. So, a lot of the early game tutorial sections are kind of write-offs. But aside from that, getting into locations, killing enemies, and fighting our way through the world of international espionage all has to be done with nothing more than James Bond's fists. So, without further ado, let me take you on a story which spans several continents, a lot of dead people, and this secret agent who likes to reveal his full name to everyone he ever meets. Let me introduce you to Bing James Bong. Bing Jong Bond. Wait, no. Doctor No. That's like the film. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah! We begin our story in Malta. James Bond is starting his fledgling career by taking on the SAS with his friends Cressida and Pokemon Road to the Poles. If they can get past this group of hardened individuals, their trainer John will clear them for active field duty, and there's a chance he could get clearance to increase their wage to just under the national minimum wage, a dream for all budding agents of the state. This is the first time James Bond sees any real action he's actually not in danger of dying from while taking part in, and it's also here he lays out the formula for his life going forward. The formula was a simple one: if it moves, beat it with your fists and surrounding environmental objects until it doesn't move anymore and you could continue. Not having access to firearms and gadgets wouldn't yet affect the young trio of would-be agents, as they would take out an entire base of Britain's finest and escape on a boat, presumably back to the very island they'd just escaped from. With the SAS base taken out, the trio were cleared for their first taste of real action at Casino Royale. Wait, what do you mean this isn't Casino Royale? Okay, fine, the Grand Carpathian Hotel. Their mission, a simple one: track and capture a man who is rumoured to be working alongside the big bads of our story. See, to get that sweet pay rise to the forbidden £12.65, 6 pence below the national minimum wage as of the upload date of this video. Look, diamonds are forever, but this video's historically accurate lifespan certainly isn't. Anyway, James Bond will have to take his fight to the core of the bank Bond and his buddies have an account with, and beat the heads of said bank to death with their bare hands, before lifting the ban put on their accounts, following a particularly troubling night out which incurred some hefty legal fees, brought on by charges of, and I quote, urinal-centric warfare. The villainous masterminds at the head of said establishment, called a pair of total bankers, are Sir Nick of Webbington and his son Webb End. Big Daddy Webb and his Nepo hire Precum have a stranglehold on the banks, and they don't give second chances, so Bond needs to make sure their reign of terror comes to an end before John asks for that sweet pay rise. Anywho, back at the Grand Carpathian, Bond is forced to be the team's driver as Pokemon Row and Cressida head inside to capture the mystery man who supposedly works with the Webheads. That is, until he sees a man who looks suspiciously like Ivan Drago from Rocky IV if he was into lux-maxing, throwing someone's luggage off a balcony. This crime makes the Bond sense tingle and he springs into action. After telling the men at the door he had some important business in the bathroom, he was let in and gave chase to lux-maxing Drago through the hotel, where he'd eventually find himself in the world's most heavily guarded laundry room. This laundry room would prove to be a dangerous, unforgiving area which would see Bond have to beat up a small army of minimum wage workers. To the average person, this would seem pretty cold and unforgivably evil, but for James Bond, a man whose life goal is to earn anything close to the minimum wage, this was a rage-filled sparring session brought on by jealousy. After caving in a few workers' heads following a stealth takedown, Bond thought this was the end of the fight, but little did he know, he'd been stalked. Bond was in enemy territory and here he was, being hunted down. Bond and the would-be assassin would take the fight to another room where our hero would hit this man so hard he'd break the laws of matter and become one with the shelving unit. Leaving the laundry room relatively unharmed and landing himself as a member of the room service team, Bond delivers some excellent room service to this needy customer and meets a beautiful maid who was unaware the new member of the room service staff looked strikingly like Dexter Morgan. After the pair exchange curious looks, Bond heads down to the bowels of the hotel yet again, knowing Pokemon Row to the Poles is down here somewhere, presumably having captured the Lux-Max Drago, but well, sadly, this was far from the truth. Pokemon Row to the Poles was bleeding to death. Oh no, he's already dead. Killed at the hands of Lux-Maxing Drago. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and for James Bond, dinner time had come around. It turns out Lux-Maxing Drago was actually a chef here, and was secretly moonlighting as an assassin for the Webheads. Bond and Drago would battle in the wine cellar, the pair both tasting plenty of different flavours of the vintage juice, before BJB found an opening and booted Drago in the chest, sending him flying. Bond obviously got hit slightly too hard on the head with one of these bottles of wine because he was seeing double, 2 Dragos for the price of 1, but rather than fistfight them, Bond picked up a sword and challenged the pair to a duel of fates. Like Qui-Gon Jinn and Kenobi versus Maul, their fight would be legendary, and wait, where are you guys going? Structural integrity be damned, the building begins to fall apart due to the ruckus caused by the Dragos and BJB. See, it turns out this whole building was held up by the wine racks in the basement, and since there were at least 75% less wine racks than there were 20 minutes ago, the building begins crumbling, and as Bond makes his daring escape, he finds Cressida crippled from the waist down. I mean, seriously, what's the point of all those push-ups if you can't lift a bloody log? Anyway, Cressida becomes crippleder, clearly realising that considering Pokemon Row was already dead, she really had no time to die now, and John appears from thin air like a guardian angel to allow Bond to chase the mystery man they came looking for in the first place. After committing some old Grand Theft Auto and being jump-scared by the maid he met earlier, who definitely might not be a maid, Bond gives chase to the man and ends up at an airfield, and it's here he has to break one of his rules. See, for some reason, despite my best efforts, you can't just run past this guy and then throw your gun at him and beat the living daylights out of him. You actually have to shoot him, nay, kill him. This sucks, but rest assured he'd be the last victim Bond would add to his count via bullet. This is the first real gun versus fist fight we'd see Bond get into, and ouch, was it a learning curve. But this was our first time, and so we knew it would be tough. See, as this run continued, I learned some really interesting things about this game, some we'll get onto later, but my first discovery was that the enemies in this game are genuinely scared to hit you with their bullets, so you get a lot of leeway, and if you add some elite movement tech akin to the movement seen in 2017 Black Ops 3 lobbies, you can actually get quite far before needing to duck and take cover, meaning we could avoid death now and maybe die another day. Although we'd seen Bond die a few times in his first major outing, this went surprisingly well, and this was before we remembered some of this game's most important features. This was only my second playthrough of 007 First Light, so I think it's forgivable that maybe I forgot some of the game's most useful features for a run, which sees Bond use no gadgets or guns. Alas, BJB ends up on a plane and hacks the control unit by hand. Don't worry, no gadgets used here. And with the power of the weapons God gave him and an excellent eye for piloting military planes, Bond hijacks the plane and flies it all the way to Aleph, the last known location of the mystery man, codenamed George Lazenby by the intel services at MI6. You might be wondering how the man got from the hotel in Slovakia to Aleph, which is in Africa. I mean, it's not a real place, but it's in Mauritania, and that's in Africa, so my point stands before Bond. Well, look, I don't know either, just bear with me on this one. Anyway, upon arriving at Aleph, John spawns in again, clearly becoming some kind of one-winged angel. Yes, that is a Kenny Omega reference. The wrestling references are so fucking back. And the pair drive right into the most wretched hive of scum and villainy this side of the equator, and Bond begins introducing himself to the locals. To find Mr. Lazenby, Bond and Greenway have to cough up 100,000 big ones, which in turn allows them access to a high-profile auction run by a man who knows exactly where the Big G is hiding out. Given the lack of gadgets, I was a little bit worried Bond wouldn't be able to get his hands on this money, so we had to get creative. After realising we couldn't hack a crypto wallet and get over half of our potential earnings, we find quite possibly the most fitting way to get some money for this challenge. I can't legally tell you what we'll be doing, but it rhymes with nightflub. Bond must first prove he can throw hands to these naysayers, and so needs to fight this man, who looks suspiciously like someone drew Tommy Fury from memory, and would you believe it, he got beaten. In the fighting ring, Bond cleans house, so pretty straightforward actually. Oh no, he's dead. Round 2, and Bond cleared house again and became a nail in the hammer's foot, stopping the reigning champion in his tracks and winning $60,000, leaving 40 to be found elsewhere. After dealing with some rowdy fans, James Bond overhears talks of a dodgy art deal going down somewhere in Aleph, and so decides to head out and impersonate the dealer, hopefully hijacking the deal and securing himself the final 40k he'd need to buy admission into the auction. Of course though, this being the breeding ground for terrorists that it is, Bond has to fight his way through a small platoon of soldiers, and they were no match for the master of the throat chop, and BJB is able to steal a burner phone and head to the location the art deal is taking place. Another group of soldiers, this time armed, would arrive, but they were no match for the movement tech, a brick to the head, and the good old glass to the dome and container to the bone combo. The art dealers show up to see the carnage, and like that, Bond and John were in the auction. Unfortunately, a gadget would be required to get past the auction section, which is a shame, but there was no way around it. Bond wins the auction by offering things I'm not comfortable telling you about in this video, and the pair begin negotiating with the leader of the auction on the whereabouts of Lazenby. But he doesn't budge, so John pulls his trump card and threatens the man with a whole season of watching Manchester United games at Old Trafford. I mean, God, this game has some brutal moments, but that's probably the worst one. MI6 truly has no limits. There are a concerning number of pirates on this abandoned vessel, but unlike the crew of the Black Pearl, these guys can be pretty easily dispatched of by hands and sheer will. Bond ends one of his first fights on the ship by utilising a keyboard as a weapon, before sending another pirate for a nice dip in the sea. In a reverse of the first fight, another group of pirates want the BJB smoke, so he obliges, throwing one crewmate overboard before channeling his inner keyboard warrior for the second kill. A final batch of pirates are sent to walk the plank before Bond and John finally meet at the location of George. They find Mr. Lazenby sleeping, probably tired of being reminded of that one time his wife was on the wrong end of a headshot during a drive-by by a bald guy. Like, seriously, do you realise how impressive that is? A headshot is hard enough to pull off as it is, but during a drive-by? Like, I don't think Bond should have been sad Tracy died. That's hella impressive. He was probably quite impressed by the marksmanship on display. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, Lazenby's asleep, and when he wakes up, he tells Bond and John to go to another boat, and when they get there, they find evidence he was innocent and never worked for the Webheads. On the way out of the evidence room, Bond is attacked while John seemingly just despawns, and this leaves Bond to fight his way through waves upon waves of armed assailants. It was here I had a thought. I can throw weapons at people in this game. This doesn't break our no gun rule, we aren't killing them with bullets, so I think it lands within our mission parameters. is. The only issue is, though, I'd convinced myself into believing you had to unload your gun before it became throwable. This wasn't the case, as I'd realised later, but for now, this was my plan. Punch, throw, takedown, and trust me, for later segments, this combo would become very, very handy. After using 2 back-to-back enemies as crash pads, Bond takes out a whole host of soldiers, and then uses one poor sap as a live meat shield in something akin to the old Gears of War multiplayer days. Once John finally spawns back in, this time with a car, the pair are cornered and look to be on death's door, but they're saved by none other than Lenny Kravitz. Yeah, I have no joke here. It kind of writes itself, doesn't it? Like, James Bond and John Greenway are saved by fucking Lenny Kravitz. Yeah. Anyway, leaving Aleph with no bullets fired and only one mandatory gadget use, the pair leave with their heads held high and head back to the Big Smoke to relax and unwind. James Bond has made some enemies though, and he finds 2 enemies in his home before... Wait, is that one of the Lux Max Dragos? Oh my god, it is. Drago 1 runs into an art museum and Bond gives chase. Unfortunately though, to get into the museum, a gadget would need to be used because, unless I'm missing something glaringly obvious, there is no way to obtain an invitation to this place without blinding a fool. Once inside, it's up to Bond to get into the security room by hook or by crook, or by just being a smarmy git. And would you believe me if I told you this was easy? Because it was. I did spend 20 minutes kind of just aimlessly wandering around, but when I locked in, it was simple. Bond takes his frustrations at me out on these janitors before rounding these guards up like zombies on Kino de Toten and throwing them to their deaths with a view to a kill, or 10. Was this the most efficient way of dealing with these overpaid chumps? Yeah, probably actually. This is probably a lot easier than beating them to death with Bond's tiring fists. Bond hacks the CCTV and discovers that Drago 1 is in the basement. You know, like before. This time though, he isn't getting away, and after heading down to the basement and engaging the spawn of Ivan in a fistfight, Bond wins, totally not using any gadget along the way, before throwing this blonde bozo into an Aquaman statue, killing him once and for all, meaning there's only one Drago left. The weirdly attractive maid we met earlier shows up, further adding proof to my theory she might not actually be a maid, and we come face to face with Webend. Bond holds his fists back as they scream to him like the Green Goblin mask, instead deciding to take a drink from this dodgy looking fella, and oh my god, he just roofied Bond. Waking up in what I can only assume is Webend's BDSM dungeon, Webb begins engaging in some light foreplay which is somehow still more bearable than the last time we saw James Bond strapped to a chair. Wait, that wasn't the last time? This guy needs to stop getting captured so easily, oh my god. The maid breaks out of her bindings and frees the pair from the dungeon's chains before escaping out of the window. I think she might be Russian, but if she is, she didn't come from Russia with love, as she leaves Bond to take out the trash by himself. No, seriously, he does take out the trash by relieving a bin lorry driver of his duty and doing his job for him, allowing the man to go home to his family. How kind of him. I did skip an entire segment there for that joke, but Bond's night isn't over, as if we skip back a few minutes we can find Bond fighting a whole host of enemies in this daring escape out of the museum. Firstly taking down a crew in this courtyard of broken dreams, pretty neatly might I add, before he enters a giant red room and absolutely clears house. Here's a fun fact, on my first playthrough of this game where I played it as intended, I actually died a total of 3 times here before getting out. On this playthrough, where Bond was limited to the things attached to his body, I did it the first time, which was honestly quite a shock to me. Anyway, back to stealing bin lorries, Bond runs across John again, the angelic fella who just seems to be magnetically attached to our favourite super spy, and the pair decide to cut out the middleman and take the fight to the web heads by entering Web Industries themselves. The pair leave the museum, having had no reason to use any gadgets at all, and of course having taken out all foes in their way by using nothing but the lethal weapons Bond was given by the Almighty. Nothing remotely interesting happens for the first 10 minutes of their visit to Webb's House of Horrors. In fact, the only thing I can actually think of mentioning is the insane amount of absolutely required gadget usages to get through this segment. You might be thinking, at this point in the video, that I haven't really been focusing on the gadget usage part of this challenge, and that's because, up until now, there really isn't a crazy amount of segments which absolutely require you to use gadgets. The game has a genuinely great way of allowing the player to approach challenges their own way, which made this challenge, so far, pretty interesting to get through. But here it feels like you're forced to do so much hacking and things of that ilk, which really dampened my spirits. Alas, where the video game gods take with one hand, they give with the other, as Bond is introduced to the middle management of Webb's house. Bond makes a good first impression, offering them plenty of tea and allowing them to really break the ice with each other. After some more forced gadget usage, Bond breaks into Webb's office and discovers that he likes paintings, really obvious passwords, and, well, himself. After digging up this self-boner the Webbs have for themselves, Bond has to escape the office and get over to the research department to dig up some more incriminating dirt on his arch-nemesis. Unfortunately, as all good buildings have, this building has a bridge which runs on a timer. Would you believe it, Bond makes it by the skin of his teeth. And once he gets there, John and the maid from earlier are waiting for him. This is most curious. I mean, it makes some sense that maybe she'd be at the art museum. She might be an admirer of the finer things in life. But here, it just doesn't add up. Anyhow, Bond and John head up to the central data server to try and cut off the Webb's access to their company, a pair of total bankers. But they can't. However, they can greatly decrease the amount of control they have by ruining 3 specific servers, all of which are guarded to the nines by employees. Bond takes each employee out, throwing, punching, running and kicking his way through the seemingly endless guards perched at each of these servers. After taking these servers down, the two had to make a daring escape. So with the odds stacked against Bond and his imaginary friend John, the run to freedom would begin. So far, this was our biggest test of skill. It really would take all we'd learned as Bond to get through this sea of rogues, and we'd have to be nearly perfect to get through this in one piece. But much like Bond himself, we weren't perfect, but we were effective. It was at this point I'd come to the realisation that guns could be used as projectiles at any point in their lifespan, whether they be full of ammo or bone dry, and using this opened up a whole new way to deal with enemies, and it also taught me something very important. Bond would actually receive a span of invincibility during his special takedowns, so these would become essential, as under this much gunfire we could really do with a quantum of solace. Which, according to my sources, means finding a bit of peace within the chaos. Look, I've really been trying to shoehorn these Bond movie titles throughout this script, so yeah, let me just have this one. And for those of you with a golden eye, let me know how many you heard. This was a bit for the Bond fans among you, so if you've been picking them up, just assume it was for your eyes only. Anyway, although tomorrow never dies, James Bond certainly might if he doesn't get a move on. So by moving like some kind of ghost or spectre, weaving in and out of enemies and phasing through them like they're not even there, Bond is able to just about reach John's newly acquired helicopter and escape Webb's house. The pair decide it's time for a holiday. After all, that whole trip had really ruined their future employment opportunities on Her Majesty's Secret Service. So they decide to work against MI6, tracking Webb End to Vietnam, where absolutely nothing has ever happened. With Bond, James Bond and John jetting off to Nam, they decide to check into the lovely resort Webb End has put himself in, presumably to get away from the maniac who punched his way through his organisation of trained killers and his schizo friend. But Webb End is more of a live and let die type of guy, so he begins killing people at said resort to get some cathartic release from this whole experience. See, Webb's evil plan isn't to make the sky fall or to make a giant gold finger. No, his evil plan is to simply stop Bond from getting that £12.65. And Bond, well, he needed that wage. His life depended on it, and he was going to fight like his life depended on it. With Webb goons surrounding the villa Bond had booked himself into, he knew it was time to flush this Webb head down the water spout, and so the assault began. Bond was becoming proficient at CQC while dealing with hordes of armed enemies, and this was no different. After taking his house back and officially becoming the #1 dealer of CTE in the known and unknown galaxy, it was time. But what was it time for, Charles, you may be asking? Well, it was time to bring the Drago bloodline to an end, and Bond was not playing now. He needed that pay rise, and God help anyone who got in his way. By leaving Drago 2 in an exploding shack, Bond all but destroyed any hope of baby Dragos appearing down the line, unless they have a long lost brother who resented them and may or may not have started an underground crime syndicate. Wait, hold on. I'll cut to the chase. Bond fights his way through this giant mine, battling seemingly endless waves of foes, knowing he was as close to Web End as he'd ever be. This was it, the coup de grace on one half of the pair of total bankers. That pay rise was within arm's reach. Leaving John behind to clear up the rest of Bond's mess, James Bond would come face to edgy golden mask with Web End. He'd use the first light to, do you get it? Get it? First light. Anyway. He would ultimately blind Webb with these floodlights before pretty brutally blinding him for real, like, for very real, by jamming a sodding needle into his eye and crushing him with steel pipes, finishing this segment out with no gadgets used and not a single bullet hitting an enemy. But what about John? All this time making sure Webb hit a dead end, we forgot about John. Bond rushes to find his totally real boss and he dies, or simply becomes a part of Bond's mind that closes itself off. John reaches his final stop and dies in the company of the man he swore to make into an almost minimum wage worker. Rest in peace, John. You will always be a part of our collective hive mind. These events clearly didn't agree with James Bond's feng shui, so he decides it's time to hit the big web, Nick Webbington, where it hurts. Right in the supercomputer. He heads off to the Arctic Circle, being joined by the mysterious maid he can seem to not shake off his tail, and the two scale the outside of Webbington's real headquarters. Once on solid ground, Bond dispatches a few enemies and heads inside, re-meet Reki. Remember Reki because he, just pretend I managed to squeeze a Thunderball joke in here, and remember him because he will be handy later. Our favourite budding super spy takes a page out of the Dark Knight's book and throws this poor unsuspecting sap to his death, before taking out another group of heavily armed buffoons, and it's at our next big fight we'd have arguably one of our toughest tests yet. Not because of enemy numbers or a difficulty spike, no, just because by this point I'd been playing this game for 5 hours straight and my senses were going numb, including my ability to think. We made it through eventually, and all this happened while my dad was watching me play. So his first and only impression of this game is that this new Bond is some pacifist moron who refuses to shoot enemies, or anyone for that matter, and only uses guns as projectiles to hurl at enemies' heads, so that's fun I guess. We then catch up to our old friend Reki, who assists us on our way to find Webb's evil supercomputer thingy we came here to destroy. Reki is absolutely vital to getting there, and so we give him a send-off he deserves by allowing him to kill plenty of less fun, more evil robots, as we leave him to kill this glorified ChatGPT. We got stuck on a simple puzzle for 20 minutes, and like I said, by this point I'd been playing for about 5.5 hours, which for someone like me who switches between things like it's no one's business, this play session was essentially an endurance marathon at this point. So my brain was running on autopilot and I really couldn't figure this out, so thankfully when I did get to punch more people in the head, it felt quite cathartic. It turns out that maid we'd been kinda into was actually a super secret spy, and while we chatted to Sir Webbington about that pay rise, she actually shot him. That's right, the goal of this whole mission had proved to be nothing more than an excuse to punch and kill people, as the one man left on Earth who could grant James Bond his dream lifestyle was killed off by the woman we thought was simply a humble hotel maid. The maid would also make off with the core processor of the evil-looking supercomputer thingy, and so we chased her down via boat, at one point even becoming one with another boat to create some kind of fusion super vessel. It wouldn't take long before the UK police finally did something useful and came to arrest Bond and the mysterious maid spy person. See, they were fugitives, and Bond had turned against his country to save his own bank account, so, you know, not ideal for old Jimmy B. Back in London, the pair would find themselves imprisoned, but not for long. Remember Web End? Well, he was alive and wanted sweet revenge on James Bond for what he'd done to him, so we'd come to get him himself. This was no longer about the money. It was about sending a message to anyone that got in the way of Bond and his pay rise that they would be killed. The maid splits, and well, there is a lot of fighting here. This is the final mission after all. So, in the interest of keeping this video below an hour, I'll cover 2 of the better segments from this final stretch. And you can actually watch the rest for yourself on my second channel, where this run in full will be uploaded to prove to you I did not cheat, and are an honourable champion of challenge runs. All of that will be linked down below, but back to business. The first fight I wanted to hone in on was the office fight, because because oh my god did this cause some pain. It was tough, don't get me wrong, but we'd also be required to use a gun to kill someone. Not directly though, we'd have to shoot a gas pipe below this sniper to blow him up, or else we weren't allowed to leave the room. It was a shame, but I am grateful that we didn't need to kill both snipers, or I really wouldn't have been happy. That aside though, this was one of the toughest rooms in the whole game, and really made me put all the skills we'd learnt so far into full practice, due to how tight and compact this section was. Added on to the fact everyone was armoured and we had snipers raining down fire on us, and yeah, this was not fun in the slightest. The second section I wanted to talk about was the Q-Lab fight. Not because it was hard, but because it was surprisingly easy. The gimmick of this fight is that you used Q's jumped up watch to use all of the gadgets you'd seen earlier in the game to defend MI6. So I assumed this would be a very gadget-centric fight, and the game would lock you into using at least one or two things from the watch. But no, it didn't. I was stunned by how easy this fight was, and I even still got to use a few of the things lying around in the lab, since technically if they weren't activated by the watch, they'd come under the category of environmental hazards. So this whole section actually turned out to be an absolute blast. If we skip over the part where the game locks you in an Aston Martin Valhalla and forces you to blow 50 enemies to Kingdom Come with rockets and machine guns, our final fight would be against Webb End. Unfortunately though, this was a fight we could not win without gadget, which did suck, but if it meant we could finally put this feud to bed once and for all, I was all for it. We used our immense movement tech and overwhelmingly funny jokes to confuse Webb and ultimately riddle him with machine gun fire, before Bond very purposely drowned him using his body weight. Not even his exosuit could help him hold his breath any longer than the honorary aquatic life form, Fish. Blubfish. The feud was settled and the lines were drawn. Bond had proven he was better than Webb and his dead father, Sir Webbington, and he'd done it by punching, sliding, throwing, kicking, and headbutting his way through their whole army. And while he may have proven himself to himself, he'd also proven himself to someone very important. All the time Bond was out there fighting for his life, it turned out the Webbs did indeed have an estranged family member, Meb. She'd been keeping a close eye on Bond and his war against her family. See, Meb was cut out of the family fortune following an argument with her brother Webb End over the best Star Wars film at Christmas dinner 2013. When her father agreed with Webb End, it was indeed A New Hope and not Revenge of the Sith. It is Revenge of the Sith though, don't get it twisted. She went rogue, and since then she changed her last name and started her own bank, the Moneypenny Bank of England. After the dust had settled, Meb came out of hiding, introduced herself to Bond James Bond, and the two spoke. They began to agree on a lot of things, and ultimately, after proving himself to her by taking her disenfranchised family down, she opened an account for Bond. An account which would have £12.65 put in it every hour for 8 hours a day until Bond meets his untimely demise. So, while he had to close his account with the pair of bankers, he finally got that pay rise he so desperately wanted, becoming the 7th member of the new bank to open an account. His card number? 007. Chills. Full body chills. And that's it for Bond James Bond. Thank you all so much for watching. I have fallen in love with this game like nothing else this year. Actually, apart from Resident Evil Requiem, I even got a tattoo of the hatchet, and it says Requiem underneath it. So it's probably fair to say that I fell in love with that game slightly more. But the point is, I really enjoyed making this video. It took a lot of work and a lot of sleepless nights, at least one sleepless night. So thank you all for watching. If you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe. It does help more than you could possibly imagine. I really like writing these silly stories for these things. They're not very good, but I think they're quite funny sometimes, and I hope you do too. I hope they add like another layer to the challenge run, as well as the challenge run, which, as I mentioned earlier, you can find on the second channel, which I will link down below. So again, thank you all for watching. Leave a like, subscribe, tell me how much I failed this challenge run and I could have done it so much easier if I'd have done other things, because I do genuinely believe there are different ways to go about this challenge run. I do think there are easier ways to go about it, and I also think there's definitely a way to get into that art museum without using a gadget. I couldn't find it. That doesn't matter. The point is, thank you for watching so much. Leave a like, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, and stay safe out there.